This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Today on Saturday Morning Breakfast, we are talking about reasoning. We are thinking about what it is, why it's important for us to teach, and the reason why it's so difficult to get people to reason.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Good morning. It is Saturday, the 2nd of November, 2024. It is 9 o'clock in the morning. It is a Saturday. That means that you are here for the Saturday Breakfast Show with me, Darren Lester. It is, as always, a pleasure to be sharing my breakfast with you today. How's your week been? We have had Halloween this week, day before yesterday. Halloween for me was really, really quiet. We had kind of on the estate, a few houses had decorated. There were a few trick-or-treating kids that I saw kind of wandering around, but nobody came to us, which I'm not complaining about because it means that the entire bowl of Haribo that we have bought to give out is now sitting on the side, ready for me to dip into whenever I am having to do my marking or my planning. It's quite a good motivator, not going to lie. If I tell myself, mark this book, have a little packet of sweets, mark this book, have a little packet of sweets, it works wonders. Probably not great for my teeth or my waistline, but, the motivation is there, and quite often that's the thing that we struggle with the most. But yeah, it seemed to be quite low key. Even kind of in the media, I didn't see anything big. There were no new Halloweeny films that came out. Nothing really dropped on any of the streaming services, except for the finale of the latest Marvel show, which I've been obsessed with. That was so good. But yeah, it seemed to me to have been quite a low-key Halloween. And you guys, if you are long-term friends of the show, you will know how I feel about holidays. I love holidays. I love festivals. And I frequently lament the fact that in England specifically, but I think the UK in general, we just don't have very many. And so, to then see Halloween, it kind of had its time, didn't it? It had its push. After I was a kid, definitely. Kind of in the 2010s, we had a lot of people really getting into it, and now it seems to have died a death again, ironically. So yeah, that was a bit of a shame. And then I've seen a few posts in the news, strangely enough, over the week about how bonfire night seems to be dying out. Now, in case you are not from the UK and you are not sure, bonfire night, Guy Fawkes night, is the 5th of November, and it celebrates the attempted blowing up of Parliament, or it celebrates the thwarted attempted blowing up of Parliament by Guy Fawkes. And we celebrate that. Traditionally, we celebrate that with bonfires, and we kind of burn an effigy of Guy Fawkes, and there are fireworks, and it's actually quite a macabre celebration if you think about it. I have done, I think 2 years ago, an entire show about Guy Fawkes and about teaching Guy Fawkes. So if you're interested, if you're kind of going to teach that as a history unit over the next couple of weeks, or if you're just interested in the history of Guy Fawkes in general, please do go back through the archives and find that. I think it would be early November 2022. that I did that one. I'm sure it wasn't last year. But yeah, the news article that I was reading suggested that that's beginning to die down now, and I saw a lot of kind of particularly district councils saying that actually they don't want to do firework displays, they don't want to do bonfires anymore, because it's a health and safety nightmare. Because it doesn't matter how many risk assessments you fill in, it doesn't matter how many people sign off to say, yes, this is safe. It only takes one person claiming that they were burned by a stray ember from a bonfire for the whole thing to fall apart. And as we know from the other thing that's been in the news over the past couple of weeks, local councils do not have the money at the moment to be sued by people who are claiming to have been burned at a bonfire. In case you haven't seen that story, it's quite interesting. With the increase in fees in private schools, where the Labour Party have kind of introduced the VAT to them, we've had a lot of parents requesting education and healthcare plans from local councils, and lots of local councils are already saying that they are feeling the strain of that and that there is potential bankruptcy in the offing if the kind of volume of requests that they're having is being kept up. So local councils are under a bit of a strain at the moment. So yeah, it's quite sad that that with Bonfire Night on the wane and with Halloween kind of disappearing, and then I've already heard people complaining about the fact that there's Christmas stuff in the shops. Now, I love Christmas. I am very happy that there is Christmas stuff in the shops already because I want to get ready for it. I want to buy my decorations. I want to put my decorations up. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to. I still got my Halloween decorations up. But Christmas is our next one after Bonfire Night, and we quite often think about or talk about joy. Finding the joy, finding the little things, particularly in our job where it's difficult, where we can face lots of complaints, where we can face constant criticism and scrutiny, and you look for the joy. And for me, festivals give a nice moment of joy. They are something that we can look forward to. They are something that we can indulge in. They are something that we can celebrate. And so I think that particularly for the secular festivals, the ones that are not tied to a faith community, and so they are open to be celebrated by everyone, I think it's really important to hold on to those just for the kind of little built-in moments of joy across the year. With all that said, I would like to wish any of my Sikh, Hindu, or Jain listeners a very happy Diwali. I hope that you are enjoying the celebrations. One of the things I always love about Diwali is that when I was at school, I was kind of taught that it was Hindu Christmas, I suppose. They talked to us in terms that we could understand. They tried to make that comparison. So in my head, Diwali was always a kind of December festival, but this year it was on Thursday. It was in October, and again, I love that. I love opening up my mind to all of these different ideas, and that just because for me it's the depths of winter, it's the November, December, January that we kind of need these light festivals, that we need these things to buoy us up. That doesn't mean that that's the same for everybody. And that's one of the joys I find in teaching my subject, in teaching foreign languages, in teaching classics, is that you can really kind of get to grips with other people. You can get to grips with other communities outside of your own. And, I just think that's really important. I just think that's really important to understand that other people have festivals, other people have celebrations that are just as important to them as yours are to you. And that the things that you kind of take for granted as being absolute truths, like we need light festivals in the deep, dark winter, are not absolute truths. They are just the things that are true for you. And there are things that are just as true for other people all over the world.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Are you a teacher who has concerns about your students' low reading levels? Are you also worried disadvantaged students won't be able to catch up? The online reading development program, Dreambox Reading Plus, adapts to a student's skill level, accelerates reading progress, and helps students acquire a wide vocabulary. The patented technology develops reading fluency and supports the transition to increased text complexity from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 and 4, where language and vocabulary are more challenging. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot.
How do we stop teachers marking books on their kitchen table on a Sunday night instead of wanting to spend time with their family? Is live marking truly cutting-edge practice? What if I told you that I could provide evidence of verbal feedback and its impact on student outcomes? Now, traditional marking, time and time again, is reported as the #1 reason why teachers leave the profession. It trumps behaviour issues and teacher salary. In Guide to Feedback, I share 9 case study skills that demonstrate 9 different ways to provide marking and feedback, all evidenced by student outcomes. Now, not every school will be ready for this, but hopefully you are ready to start your Feed Up and Feed Forward journey.
The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback is out now, and you can get an exclusive 30% discount when you order Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback from Bloomsbury.com. Just use the code TTRGTF at the checkout. That's TTRGTF, and it expires 30th of November. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week and BBC Breakfast both focused on the importance of work experience for young people, as new research shows the scale of the challenge involved in meeting the government's aims of 2 weeks for all. A report by the Social Market Foundation looked at the role of assumed knowledge in youth transitions from education to employment. The evidence, the report says, shows that young people from more privileged backgrounds and those with graduate parents appear more confident and adept at navigating their way through education and into careers. Data from Management Information System ARBA suggests that work experience provision varies hugely across the country. But overall, while 78% of secondary schools in the sample recorded some pupils as having done some work experience in Year 10, only 49% of pupils themselves actually took part. Where pupils were getting work experience, it averaged at just under a week. Just 2% of pupils completed 2 weeks. The government is aiming to guarantee 2 weeks' worth of work experience for every young person, but many say the plan is too ambitious given the current position. For the target to be achieved, many more employers will need to offer places, quadruple the current number, or at least those who already offer it to give more days to more pupils. The research suggests that there is a stark north-south divide. In all regions in the north of England, the proportion of pupils who go on work experience is lower than in the south. Schools suggest that the cost of organising and running placements was high, as it took staff to organise it and make visits, check health and safety, and that this placed pressure on already tight budgets. Some also said the pandemic had made things more difficult, as working from home had changed the way businesses work. Schools Week also reports on delays to the publication of 2024 league tables. Parents choosing a secondary school for their child this month will now not be able to see the most recent performance league tables after government delayed their publication. The move follows schools finding errors with their Key Stage 4 and 5 results data in pre-publication checks. The school's checking exercise deadline has now been extended until the 7th of November. Secondary data was due to be published on the 24th of October and would include Progress 8 scores. Parents choosing a secondary school for their child must submit their choices by October the 31st. The data allows parents to compare schools, but leaders said the delay should not cause a huge inconvenience, as many will have already made decisions based on open days, other information and experiences. The Department for Education said that a new portal had suffered technical difficulties, but that they were working hard to resolve it. The BBC reports that the government is considering a smacking ban for England. Bans have already been brought in by devolved governments in Scotland and Wales, as well as Jersey, which outlaws the use of physical violence to punish children. Plans for the laws in England were rejected by the previous government as recently as last year. The move comes following fresh calls for a ban by the Children's Commissioner for England, Dame Rachel de Souza. She said, "If we are serious about keeping every child safe, it's time England takes this necessary step." In England and Northern Ireland, it is legal for a carer or parent to discipline their child physically if it is reasonable punishment. But the Children's Act 2004 made it illegal to assault a child causing actual or grievous bodily harm. Finally, Sky News covers the issue of teachers who experience bullying at work and who signed non-disclosure agreements as part of their exit from the workplace. Sky News says it has spoken to more than 320 current and former teachers from the state, private and special school sectors across the UK. Among those, 119 say they signed NDAs and received payouts. Sky News says it has calculated the amount paid out at more than £1.73 million. The National Education Union confirmed that the vast majority of financial settlements include NDAs, but that these were not appropriate as it covered up the issue and prevented further investigations. The NEU went on to say that it felt that the growth of multi-academy trusts had contributed to a significant power imbalance between management and teaching staff. Ofsted declined to comment on the findings of the investigation, which also suggests pressures on leaders from the inspectorate caused additional stresses in schools. Education Minister Catherine McKinnell responded to the Sky News investigation by saying, "All school staff should feel safe and supported at work." This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
As always, thank you, Joe, for that fascinating roundup of what's been going on over the last couple of weeks. It was, in fact, the secondary school choices deadline that prompted my idea for the show this week, because one of the things that I have done throughout my teaching career is tutor for the 11 plus exams that still happen. Now, again, for those who are outside of the UK, maybe in areas where grammar schools are not particularly a thing, you do have the option in England to have your child sit a test when they are 11 years old. And that test can get them entry to a grammar school, which traditionally are the schools that really focus on academics, and so they are academically selective schools. These tests are quite narrow ranging, to be honest. They tend to test verbal reasoning, non-verbal reasoning, and spatial reasoning. And as I've tutored these, as I've kind of worked with children on developing their reasoning skills, I've learned a lot about kind of how people reason, and I've become really interested in the ways, the whys, and the wherefores that people reason. And so that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today. We're going to do one of my shallow dives where I have kind of brought my own experience. I have merged it with some research that I've done. There's a really interesting study that we're going to talk about. And yeah, we're just going to kind of reasoning today. So, as always, if you would like to be involved with the conversation, you can be. There are a few ways that you can get in touch with me. If you are one of the listeners live in Podbean right now, good morning to you. You can text in. The option is right there in the app for you. I will read your text live on air and respond, and we can have a nice conversation about reasoning that way, if you so wish. If you are listening to me live elsewhere, you're not in Podbean right now, you can also be in touch via Twitter, which is currently known as X. You can message me. I am at Mr. D. Lester. If you want to tag me in a message, I will read your message out live on air, and I will engage with you that way. Similarly, if you are listening later on, if you are listening to me as a podcast, if you are listening in playback, and you still want to engage with the conversation, you can, because, as I always say, these are topics that I'm interested in, so I will happily read your message and kind of engage with you that way. So all sorts of ways that you can have your voice heard over the next hour on the show. So reasoning is, if we're going by a very nice, tidy dictionary definition, the capacity of consciously applying logic to a situation, the ability to draw valid conclusions from information, be that new information or existing information, with the aim of finding an absolute truth. Now, of course, this does imply that there is such a thing as truth. This does imply that there is such a thing as objective, provable reality, which is not a conversation that we're gonna have today. That's been 2 years worth of lectures on my EdD program, quite honestly, so we don't have time to fit that in to our hour today. But that's kind of what we have to take for granted as a starting point if we're going to argue that reasoning is important. Quite often, the ability to reason is one of the things that is given as what separates humans from animals. The fact that we can take on board this new information, the fact that we can process it, that we can then change our worldview, change our minds, change our ideas to fit with the new information that we are given. And that is kind of what we're expecting children to do all of the time. The whole point of teaching is to give children new information, and we expect them to adapt what they've previously thought up until that point to the new information that they are given. It's the point of feedback, isn't it? Is that they have thought one thing, maybe they misunderstood something that we taught, and so they learnt it incorrectly. They believed that it was true, but our feedback gives them new information that they then have to reason into a new truth. And reasoning is quite often the thing that underpins philosophy, it underpins religion, it underpins science, it underpins maths, it underpins art, it underpins language. pretty much everything we do is underpinned by this idea of reason, by this idea of exploring new information and uncovering truth. The etymology of reason is really interesting. I'm a linguist, of course. I'm going to talk to you about the etymology in Greek. So it was the Greeks who kind of came up with this idea, because of course it was. Why would it not have been? The Greeks like to take credit for everything. So the ancient Greek word for reason was logos, which is the root of our word logic. So logic and reason are etymologically intertwined. But of course, logos is a really interesting word in ancient Greek, because it also meant speech, it meant word, it meant explanation, it meant account, like when you were drawing up your money that has been handled, your accounts, all of those things were logos. And again, one of the things that I find really interesting as a linguist is to think about what that means for a person who has this one word for all of these concepts. Did they see them as separate things? Did they see words and speech and explanations and financial accounts and reasoning as being different things? Or were they all the same? Were they all just logos? That then was translated into Latin as ratio. Ratio is quite an interesting way to translate logos, because its original meaning was like a theory or a view or a doctrine or a system. So then when it was used to translate logos, it also took on that explanation of finance and explanation and all of that sort of thing. Ratio then became raison in French, which then became reason in English. So we've kind of got this really nice flow of etymology there, this really nice kind of translation, I suppose. But what I find really interesting about the English reason is that it strips away the word construct. It strips away the financial constructs, and it kind of just leaves this concept of reasoning and of justifying. Give me a reason that you have done that. So the English kind of strips down what was a very wide-ranging Greek and Latin word into something a lot tighter, something a lot narrower. What's quite interesting is that the earliest English publishing philosophers, so I'm thinking about people like Francis Bacon and John Locke, because they also wrote in Latin and French, they would use all of these words interchangeably. So they use logos and ratio and raison and reason all to mean exactly the same thing. And so this is why in English we tend to get this overlap between reason and rationality, because they were using ratio, which is again the root of rational, just as a synonym for reason, for reasonable. I do think it's important, I've probably bored everybody by now with my explanation of words, but I do think that whenever you are looking at a concept, looking at the history of the word is really, really important, because it is the word that gives us the connotations of the concept. It's the word that defines the concept for us. And I think if you can understand, like I said about festivals earlier, if you can understand how other people have defined the concept, how other people have seen it, you can kind of learn more about how it is seen in your own language's worldview. So going back then to ancient Greece, where we've got our classical philosophers, they understood everything as being teleological. So that is that everything has a very specific purpose that fits within a natural order. And that natural order had some kind of aim, it had some kind of purpose, it had some kind of reason. So I think it was Heraclitus who argued that even the cosmos, the concept of space, had a reason behind it. So for the classical philosophers, reason wasn't then just something that people had. You know, I said a few minutes ago that it's often given as one of the things that separates humans and animals, but for the classical philosophers, it wasn't. For the classical philosophers, reason was something that created order. It was something that everything had. Everything had an innate reason for being. It was more important. It was the most important, they argued, of the characteristics. Because it was something that we shared with nature. So quite often in a modern mindset, we quite often like to put ourselves above nature, don't we? I've said it twice now, what separates humans from animals. Whereas for the classical philosophers, for an ancient Greek and ancient Roman mindset, it was all about shared characteristics that were the most important. It wasn't about setting us apart from nature. It was about reasoning our place within it. They kind of saw the mind or the soul, that it was the same thing to the Greeks, as the monarch. I think Plato described it as the monarch, who ruled over the other parts of our personality, like our thumos, our spiritedness, and our passions. So starting with Plato, it started to be argued that the mind should take priority over everything else. And it was through that this idea of being rational, being reasonable, became important. Because if you were rational, if you were reasonable, you didn't think with your fists or with other body parts. You thought with your head. And you did what was best, not just for yourself, but for everybody around you. We talked about eudaimonia not so long ago, this idea of the height of well-being, the height of happiness. And for Aristotle, that eudaimonia, the height of well-being, was living a life which was consistently, excellently, and completely in accordance with reason. So for Aristotle, the best way for you to take care of your well-being, the best way to practice self-care, was to be reasonable, to listen to reason, to act within reason. Now, Aristotle and Plato's beliefs have been widely discussed and widely debated. It's one of the rare occasions that I can think of, bearing in mind that I'm a linguist and not a philosopher, so there are probably loads that I just have never heard of. But it's one of the rare occasions one of the rare concepts that I can think of where we're kind of not taking Platonic, Aristotelian views for granted, but we are kind of saying, well, hold on, no, because of X, Y, and Z. But they were very important and they were very influential, because what they did was they took this concept of reason. They took this concept of the conflicting parts of humanity, the rational and the animal, the kind of the passions and the logic, and they put it within a context that fit with the rising monotheistic beliefs of the ancient world. It kind of it worked within the burgeoning Christianity that was becoming prevalent around the Roman Empire, and it kind of found a way for humanity to fit within, the creation story of Genesis in a way that didn't really need to happen before, with the creation stories of Hellenismos and with Religio Romana, because it wasn't necessary. So we have also, right from the beginning, this idea of trying to fit philosophy in with religion. And, religion was one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning, that has an underpinning within reason, or that requires reason. This view, then, was very much adapted by the early church. And the early church fathers thought that Greek philosophy, the Greek view of reason, was indispensable. They saw it as this instrument. They saw it as this tool by which they could understand God's working on earth, I suppose. And so a lot of the early fathers, the early church fathers, they really pushed reasoning as being important. They really pushed this idea that we should be reasonable people. We should be listening to evidence and coming to our own conclusions. Thomas Aquinas, of course, being one of the most influential Christian philosophers, he really ran with this. And for Thomas Aquinas, everything was about being able to fit people in with nature. It was, if you couldn't justify it within nature, then it wasn't justifiable. That was essentially Thomas Aquinas's view of religious thought and how we all fit into the world. And so again, for him, this idea that we could be reasonable, that we could be rational, it was that peak. Being ruled by your head instead of your heart. It was everything that he wanted to believe, and it made sense to him. And that has kind of been how it's been passed down to us. Now, of course, reason these days has kind of lost its religious connotations. We don't tend to think of reason and religion as one and the same. Lots of people will try and pit them against each other. But the reason that reason is shown as so important to us is because of that classical religious underpinning. And, we know that in so many Western countries, it was the original religious beliefs that kind of shaped the morality, that shaped the thought. And again, I think that's really interesting for us to think about how these things that we just take for granted as being important, we just take for granted that we need to teach our children how to reason because reasoning is important. It did actually start somewhere. And it started with the Greeks. And it started with the Greeks trying to reason how we fit in with nature. Now, in this research that I've been doing into reason, I found that basically there are 3 different types of reasoning that don't fit nicely into the verbal reasoning, spatial reasoning, non-verbal reasoning categories of the 11 plus exam. And we can kind of group them as self-reasoning, social reasoning, and independent reasoning. So self-reasoning is this idea of justifying your decisions. So the majority of the time that we as adults and our children, although they may not necessarily know that this is what they're doing, use reasoning is to justify a decision that we have already made. So we've kind of gone a little bit backwards, I suppose, from what those early Greek, Roman philosophers were arguing about the head being what should drive all of our decisions. And we are making decisions with our heart. We are following our gut, and then using our head to justify them afterwards. We tend to make our decisions, according to a lot of the studies that I've read this week, decisions tend to be made based on intuition or desire, and we then seek a reason to prove that we were correct. We look for that confirmation bias. Confirmation bias usually ignores evidence and arguments that we don't like, and just takes into account what we do like. We don't always realize that we're doing this, though. There is something called the bias blind spot that I've been really interested to read about, which is this idea that you don't realize that you are being biased always. Quite sometimes you do, and I'm sure lots of people, I may be causing you to rankle right now because you may be sitting there saying, well, I'm incredibly self-aware, Darren. Of course I know my biases, and you probably do. A lot of us are aware of a lot of our biases, but we do still all have those blind spots, because no matter how empathetic we are, no matter how open-minded we are, we still only live our own experience. And the only reality that we can actually encounter is our own. And so there may well be things that we are biased about, but we don't realize that because we don't realize that someone else's experiences are different. Which, again, as I've argued, particularly last week and then a couple of weeks before, where I was talking about reading for pleasure, this is why cultural capital is so important. This is why broadening our children's horizons is so important. It's why broadening our own horizons as adults is so important, because we can encounter other people, we can encounter other ways of life, and we can kind of try and minimize this bias blind spot. This tends to happen, this confirmation bias use of reasoning tends to happen when we are looking to build a case for what we want rather than trying to find some kind of objective truth. And kind of, as I alluded to about half an hour ago, it's possible to argue that there is no objective truth, that everything is just our own interpretation, that everything is just what we want. We then use our reasoning to confirm our pre-made decision, to confirm our bias, and prove that we were right, and prove that the decision we've made was a good one. And how often do we teach reasoning in the classroom as confirmation bias? Because I know that I've done it this week, where I was teaching year 13 French, and we were writing an essay on the book, and the kids were making points, and I said, you've got to justify your viewpoint. You've got to use the text to support your argument. I wasn't telling them whether or not they were right. And realistically, for the mark scheme, it didn't matter whether or not they were right. What mattered was that they could justify their point of view, they could justify their opinion. So I was teaching them to reason according to their confirmation bias. I was teaching them to specifically seek out the quotes from the text that supported the argument that they were saying, that they were putting across. And we didn't worry about anything in the text that kind of refuted their point. I want to think that if any of them had tried to make a point that was particularly outlandish, then I might have counter-argued it with a point from the text. But then is that just my own confirmation bias saying, no, you're wrong, and this is how I can justify that? We want to justify our decisions quite often just because it makes us feel good. We have, as people, this need for internal consistency, and this drives us for a justification of our actions, of our decisions, of our desires that at least has some kind of superficial validity. We like our decisions to fit with our own sense of self. Now, our sense of self is really interesting because it changes, it varies, our identity switches up depending on exactly what it is we are doing at any given time. Again, if you haven't heard it, a couple of years ago, I think it was one of my very first shows, I did a show on building professional identity, and this idea that identity is quite often just a performance of who we would like to be, of who we think we are. And we use reasoning to support and to build and to fortify that concept of our own performance of our identity. And again, we will use our reasoning to support our confirmation bias and to say, this is what somebody like me thinks, and so this is what I think. But quite often when we are even just arguing with ourselves, we're driven by what other people might think. I'm doing it here and now. Kind of as I'm talking to you, I am aware of the fact that you are my audience. I'm aware of the fact that you are listening. I'm aware of the fact that you will have opinions, that you will have justifications, you will have reasons. You will be listening to me and spotting my own biases. You may have even spotted my bias blind spot. And if you have, please could you let me know so that I can work on that. And kind of in thinking about these things and in taking my audience into account and that acceptance, that wanting to build community, you quite often feel a need to appear logical. Because even though we talk about how it's good to follow your gut, and, you know, we say, oh, follow your heart, you know, get married, whatever it might be, we do as a society still value and still prioritize logic. And so quite often as people, we want to look like we are being logical. We want to appear logical so that we can fit in with the community that we're building. One of the reasons that I do so much research for this show isn't just so that I can pass that on to you all, because I think that that academic research is really, really important, but it's so that I appear knowledgeable and logical in my choices of what I'm talking about. And that kind of drives, or that is driven by this need to be accepted by you guys, by my audience. And so kind of success in this self-reasoning then is about being able to come up with this internally consistent idea of ourselves that is seen by other people as being logical, because that's kind of where our priorities lie.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Are you a teacher who has concerns about your students' low reading levels? Are you also worried disadvantaged students won't be able to catch up? The online reading development program, Dreambox Reading Plus, adapts to a student's skill level, accelerates reading progress, and helps students acquire a wide vocabulary. The patented technology develops reading fluency and supports the transition to increased text complexity from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 and 4, where language and vocabulary are more challenging. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot.
How do we stop teachers marking books on their kitchen table on a Sunday night instead of wanting to spend time with their family? Is live marking truly cutting-edge practice? What if I told you that I could provide evidence of verbal feedback and its impact on student outcomes? Now, traditional marking, time and time again, is reported as the #1 reason why teachers leave the profession. It trumps behaviour issues and teacher salary. In Guide to Feedback, I share 9 case study skills that demonstrate 9 different ways to provide marking and feedback, all evidenced by student outcomes. Now, not every school will be ready for this, but hopefully you are ready to start your Feed Up and Feed Forward journey.
The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback is out now, and you can get an exclusive 30% discount when you order Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback from Bloomsbury.com. Just use the code TTRGTF at the checkout. That's TTRGTF, and it expires 30th of November. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at BetUK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at BetUK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Social reasoning, so this second form of reasoning, that's all about persuasion. And again, I found myself with that same class, that year 13 class, writing their essay about the book that we're studying. I found myself doing exactly the same thing this week. They would write their essay, and all throughout their writing, I was saying to them, persuade me that you are right. Persuade me that your interpretation of the book, of the question, is the correct one. And again, this is quite often the way that we teach children to reason, because this is social reasoning. It's one of the things that reasoning is. It's about getting people to buy into your argument, to buy into your way of thinking, perhaps even to convert their way of thinking by, as we just talked about, setting out that logical argument, showing them that your way of thinking has a better logical consistency, has a better internal consistency than the way of thinking that they had before. I've told the story about the year 5 girl that I taught a long, long time ago, who was convinced that pencils were liquid. Her reasoning behind this was solid, I'm sorry, that was an awful pun that I didn't even intend. I usually like it when I plan my rubbish puns. But her reasoning was sound. She knew that liquids took on the shape of a container, because that was what I had taught in science that liquids did. She took a group of pencils, she put them into a pencil pot, and the group of pencils took the shape of the pencil pot. So she could demonstrate using her own reasoning why she was right and why pencils were liquid. And it blew her mind when I took one pencil. I took her over to the sink in the classroom. I dropped my pencil into the sink, and it didn't take the shape of the sink. Now, what I was doing was teaching her that pencils are in fact not a liquid, they are a solid, but that maybe when you have a lot of pencils together, they act in a way that mimics a liquid. But what I was actually doing was social reasoning. I was trying to persuade her that my line of thinking, pencils are a solid, was more internally consistent than her line of thinking, pencils are a liquid. And I did that by disproving her theory. That's kind of the nature of science, isn't it? That you can't actually prove that anything is 100% infallible. All you can do is refute ideas to the contrary, that all you can do is kind of prove that ideas that say you're wrong don't work. There's also debating. Now, debating is a much harder form of reasoning because you are not alone in having a strong opinion. Up until now, all of the types of reasoning that we've talked about just relied on you having a very strong opinion and being able to express that, which again is why language is so important. But when you're debating, you are coming up against somebody who has an equally strong opinion and is also trying to persuade you with their line of reasoning, with their internal logic. And what you then have to do is find reasonable answers to their questions, or to find reasonable refutes to their points. And so again, what you are doing is building up an internally consistent logic. And I think this wasn't a conclusion I came to before the show, but the more I speak, the more I think that this is all reasoning really boils down to, is having an internally consistent logic. You can't necessarily prove an absolute truth, but you can prove that something is at least consistent. And maybe that's how we need to approach reasoning, teaching reasoning with our children. That actually you don't need to worry about absolute truth, because maybe that doesn't exist. Just worry about being consistent, about being able to support what you are saying. Finally, there is independent reasoning. And independent reasoning is kind of the opposite approach of what we've been talking about up until now. Up until now, we've been talking about reasoning as kind of knowing the truth and trying to express that. Independent reasoning, however, is about seeking truth. It's about not knowing and trying to find it. So this comes through discussion, which is, when you sit and you talk openly about something, and you ask questions and you examine from every viewpoint. And this kind of takes us back to what the Greeks and the Romans were talking about in terms of reasoning. This idea that you take something that is unknown to you and you take in this new information and you bend this new information, you work this new information to either fit your worldview or to change your worldview. When you are discussing, unlike when you debate, you don't take a fixed position, but you are open to that change. You are open to that malleability. And again, this is something that we don't tend to teach as reasoning, but is important for us to teach our young people, and is important for something for us as adults to remember, that actually it is reasonable. It is using reasoning to sit and to listen to other ideas. You don't have to believe them. Listening to an opposing viewpoint doesn't automatically change your mind. How easy would our jobs as teachers be if it did? If we could just get up there and speak to our students and then automatically they were convinced of what we were saying and they remembered it. That would make our lives so much easier. So listening doesn't change your mind. The quality of the argument that you're listening to, the internal consistency, the internal logic of the argument that you're listening to, and how it fits with your own internal logic, that's what convinces you. Dialogue, that second aspect of independent reasoning, is the same. But dialogue tends to be an exploration of how other people think. So discussion is the exploration of a subject. Dialogue is the exploration of thinking, of that metacognition behind it. But dialogue is an interesting one because dialogue requires trust. Because dialogue needs you to admit when you don't know something. And that can be difficult. And that can seem counterintuitive to reasoning, because we've spent 40 minutes talking about how reasoning is all about building up that internal consistency. And how can you be consistent if you don't actually know everything that you are talking about? But for me, that's one of the reasons why reasoning is important, is because no one person can know everything. Even within your specialist subjects, you don't know everything. You can't know everything. And I think it is important to be aware of the limitations of your understanding, to know the things that you don't know, so that you can get better, so that you can improve, so that you can build up an increasingly consistent argument, an increasingly consistent sense of yourself. So reasoning is important to teach our young people, not just because it helps them to express themselves, not just because it helps them to learn, not just because it helps them to make sense of the world, but also because it helps them to come to terms with not knowing things. And this is really, really important for our higher able pupils, our higher ability pupils, our more able pupils. Because quite often when we do reasoning with the higher attaining pupils, and let's be honest, it does tend to be the higher attaining pupils that get training in reasoning. They tend to be the ones who are invited to debate clubs. They tend to be the ones who sit the 11+ exams. But they are also quite often the children whose internal sense of self is built on this idea of being more able, of being clever. They are the ones who might self-define as the clever kids. Which is great until they start to encounter things they don't know, because that then shakes their sense of identity. It makes them feel inadequate. It makes them feel like they're not who they thought they were. But if we can take this dialogic form of reasoning, and we can say part of reasoning is being open to the things that you don't know and finding them out, that might help to secure that sense of self. That might help to mitigate any issues that they have in expanding their horizons, expanding their knowledge, realizing that they don't have to know everything, and that doesn't make them less clever. It just makes them human. It makes them people.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Are you a teacher who has concerns about your students' low reading levels? Are you also worried disadvantaged students won't be able to catch up? The online reading development program, Dreambox Reading Plus, adapts to a student's skill level, accelerates reading progress, and helps students acquire a wide vocabulary. The patented technology develops reading fluency and supports the transition to increased text complexity from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 and 4, where language and vocabulary are more challenging. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot.
How do we stop teachers marking books on their kitchen table on a Sunday night instead of wanting to spend time with their family? Is live marking truly cutting-edge practice? What if I told you that I could provide evidence of verbal feedback and its impact on student outcomes? Now, traditional marking, time and time again, is reported as the #1 reason why teachers leave the profession. It trumps behaviour issues and teacher salary. In Guide to Feedback, I share 9 case study skills that demonstrate 9 different ways to provide marking and feedback. all evidenced by student outcomes. Now, not every school will be ready for this, but hopefully you are ready to start your Feed Up and Feed Forward journey.
The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback is out now, and you can get an exclusive 30% discount when you order Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback from Bloomsbury.com. Just use the code TTRGTF at the checkout. That's TTRGTF, and it expires 30th of November. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at BetUK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
All right, we're going to finish off today with a really interesting paper that I read. This is by Trusch, Johansson, Hall, and Mercier, published in 2015, so it's quite an old paper now, but it's interesting nonetheless. It was called The Selective Laziness of Reasoning, and I'm not going to lie, it was the title that drew me to it. We were told at a lecture a couple of weeks ago, not to go for snappy titles because we should be doing things that are search engine optimized so that people will find our work. But I quite like a snappy title. I think it draws you in. But this paper essentially looked into people's own perception of their reasoning. And kind of what happened when people did reason. And they kind of just proved, essentially, everything that I've talked about today. So they came to the conclusions that people are generally more stringent in evaluating other people's arguments than their own. So you are more likely to pick holes in somebody else's reasoning than you are in your own reasoning. So that relates back to what we were talking about regarding the confirmation bias earlier, that you will quite happily ignore the things that don't make sense regarding your own line of argument. Whereas if you are debating somebody else, you are more likely to pull apart the things that don't make sense in theirs. And so they wanted to look at how selective laziness influenced reasoning, and they did this research by choice blindness manipulation, which I'd never heard of, but it obscures the original answers to a study. Oh, sorry, no, it doesn't at all. It obscures answers that have previously been given to questions in order to study how participants evaluate arguments presented as somebody else's. So what they essentially did was they presented these people's arguments back to them, but pretended that they were somebody else's. They found that we give in to confirmation bias. So we have a tendency to find arguments to support our own viewpoints. They found that we tend to lack any kind of argumentative strength, that because of this confirmation bias and because of our internal sense of belief, we don't necessarily justify our own opinions and our own viewpoints particularly strongly. And again, this is something that those of us, I think, particularly humanities subjects, we find all the time, that our pupils, when they write essays, they will not always justify their argument completely because to them it makes sense. To them, it's obvious what they're saying. And I quite often have to say to my pupils, I'm not in your head. I don't know what you believe, so you've got to lay it out for me like I'm stupid. Because of your own biases, because of the way that you interpret the world, you might see this thing as being self-evident. You might see this thing as obvious, but I don't necessarily see that. And then they kind of found a support for Kahneman's dual process theory, which is that reasoning tends to have an over-reliance on initial intuitions, that we tend to believe the first thing that we hear. In the first experiment that they did with this paper, they looked at 237 people within the US. They got these people to answer reasoning problems and provide arguments. Then they had their answers manipulated, so they were changed so it wasn't obvious that people were reading their own answers, and they were then presented back to them as being the opinion of somebody else. And it was this manipulation that was the choice blindness to obscure the original answers. So, you know, what color is the sky? The sky is blue. It comes back. Somebody else said that the sky is blue. Do you agree? And then they had to kind of analyze they had to talk about the convincingness of that other person's argument. 53% of the people noticed that the answers had been changed, so that's fine. Of those that didn't, 56% of them rejected their own argument. And they were more likely to reject an argument because they believed that it was poorly argued than for any other reason. So even though it was their own argument, and they were saying, yes, this is what I believe and this is why, when it was presented as coming from somebody else, they were more likely to reject it and to say that argument doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Their second experiment did a similar methodology with 174 different people, but they added an extra phase in. So they started by asking for a quick, intuitive answer to a question. Then they asked for justification of that answer, and they were allowed to change their answer if they wanted to. And then they evaluated other people's arguments, with one of them being manipulated. What they found is that rejection of their own invalid arguments, once again, was higher than when they thought it was coming from somebody else. So from this, they kind of suggest that people critically evaluate arguments when they are perceived as being from other people, even if they completely agree with what you believe or with what they believed, they were still more likely to critique them if they thought it came from somebody else. They were less critical, though, when arguments supported their own conclusions, when arguments kind of supported their confirmation bias. And they kind of believe that argument generation lacks refinement without opposition. So when you are allowed to just blithely state what you think, you don't worry about justifying it as much as when somebody is going to come back to you and say, no, I think that's wrong. So they suggest that debate is better for argument refinement than discussion. And this could have quite big implications for the classroom, particularly at kind of A-level and university level. A-level level and university level, because a lot of lessons are discussion based, where we do say to the children, oh, what do you think? Why do you think that? Support that with quotes from the text, depending on what you're teaching. But if we were to set up more of a debate-based classroom where we could have our students reject each other's ideas, try to change minds. And we did that more often. I know that lots of teachers do, and I know that it does happen in schools, but if we could do that more often, if we could make that a basic teaching technique, we might be able to encourage our young people to reason more succinctly and to present their arguments in a more logical, internally consistent way, which is, as we've talked about for the last hour, the whole point of reasoning. So there we go. That is reasoning. That is kind of why we do it. That's what it's for. That's why it's important. I think there are all kinds of things out there online for helping to develop reasoning skills in children. But I do think that ultimately, debate is the best one for us, because I think it's the one that encourages our young people to really think about what they're saying, to really think about what they believe, and to kind of make sure that what they are stating as truth does in fact hold up to scrutiny. We're going to end it there for today, because we have a show coming in live from Japan, which starts at 10:30, which is when I would usually end. So I want to make sure that everything can be set up ready for the next show. Tim has texted in, good morning to you, to say, what a fascinating and insightful show. Thank you for presenting it so beautifully. Well, thank you very much. That's really kind of you to say. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. I hope that you've been able to take something away from it. I always love getting feedback on the show. So if you did enjoy today's show, please do make sure that you leave us a review wherever you are listening, because it does help not just Saturday Morning Breakfast, but it does help Teachers Talk Radio as an institution out. So yeah, I'm going to leave you there for now. Please do stay tuned though for the amazing shows that we've got coming in over the rest of the weekend, and I will see you next Saturday. Thank you all very, very much, and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.